Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching and welcome to my YouTube channel, Philosophy Clips. In this philosophy clip, I'll be discussing Kant's formula of humanity. Now before I get to a discussion of the formula of humanity, I want to spend some time discussing the categorical imperative. I want to make sure that we're clear on the supreme principle of Kant's moral system, talk about the initial formulation of the categorical imperative, the formula of the universal law, and then allow that to set the stage for a discussion of the formula of humanity. Now, at the conclusion of this video, I'll discuss a couple of limitations that seem to present themselves regarding Kant's formula of humanity, at least the way he understood the principle. So let's begin with the categorical imperative. So in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant, he famously developed the notion of the categorical imperative. And he tells us that the categorical imperative is a kind of imperative that holds independent of our particular subjective desires or goals. In this way, categorical imperatives are distinct from what are known as hypothetical imperatives, which depend on our antecedent goals. So if I have a goal of making a philosophy video, then I set for myself certain obligations, don't I? Obligations to do what's required for making the video, like open up my photo booth app, get out my microphone, my Blue Yeti, etc., in order to produce the video in question. But when it comes to categorical imperatives, they are imperatives that are generated independently of our antecedent, as I said, desires or goals. Now, for Kant, he thought that this captured an intuitive notion, an intuitive aspect of morality, of moral principles. And I'd like to capture this just by having you think about an intuitive example. Suppose you're betrayed by a loved one, and perhaps the person told some lies about you, or did something else that was just terrible, and you're betrayed by your friend. And I suppose you confront your friend about it, and your friend says, I didn't have the antecedent goal to be a good friend in the first place. I think that you would likely, at least in your mind, if not verbally, you tell your friend, that's not how it works. It doesn't work like that. The morality of friendship does not work like that. The morality of friendship is such that you have obligations independent of your goals, whether or not you want to be a good friend or not. That's just one kind of example, and we could multiply examples if we wanted to. But hopefully you see the significance, right, of the intuitiveness of Kant's point here. Some of the obligations we have are generated independently of our antecedent goals. The first formulation of the categorical imperative is known as the formula of the universal law. And you all likely know that for Kant, the feature of an action, or the feature related to an action that makes an action a moral one when it is the reason for acting. And so it's no surprise when Kant tells us that the supreme principle of morality, the formula of the universal law, is the foundation of morality, because it involves thinking about our reason for acting, because Kant claims that our reason for acting is the location, as it were, if I can put it that way, of the morality of an action, of any action for that matter. And so the way the formula of the universal law goes is act for a reason that can be intended as a universal law. I'll say it again, act for a reason that can be intended as a universal law. And the way I like to understand this principle, at least initially, there's much more to be said about it, but at least initially, it's a principle that governs the form of our reason for acting. It helps us as Kant tells us in the groundwork, it helps us to determine whether or not our reason can serve as a universal law, can be such that anyone or everyone could act for it. So in this way, the formula of universal law is this principle that regulates the form of our reason for acting. So when we act, in order for our action to be moral, it's got to be the case that our reason for acting pass this universalizability test of sorts, that our reason for acting be such that it be a universal law. So that's the formula of universal law. It's the first principle of the categorical imperative. And it might seem confusing because Kant's going to then give us further principles. We'll stop at the formula of humanity, but Kant gives us several principles, formulations of the categorical imperative. And that might be confusing because Kant was seeking the supreme principle of morality. The supreme principle of morality suggests that there's one such principle, but we're given several. Kant says no worries, they're all equivalent. There's debate about what that means. Let's set that problem aside. Okay, that's a thorny problem that will take us too far afield in Kant interpretation to be serviceable in a video like this. So this initial introduction discussion of the categorical imperative hopefully has paved the way for discussion of the formula of humanity. So let me just state the principle, and then we'll do some thinking about it, reflecting on it. So again, it's a principle that should govern our reason for acting. Sometimes it doesn't come off that way when you read the Kant, but he intends it. He intends for it to. So act in such a way that you treat humanity, or the humanity in yourself or that of another, as an end in itself, and never as a mere means. I think I'd like to understand this principle as a necessary claim, right? So it's necessary that when one acts, that one treats humanity as an end in itself and never as a mere means. Now, before getting into some of the important concepts in the principle that need some discussion, like humanity, like end in itself, like mere means, let me see if I can motivate why Kant thought he needed the formula of humanity. Well, remember, the categorical imperative provides us with principles that are to hold independent of our particular subjective goals. So the formula of humanity has to be such that it appreciates that aspect. Otherwise, it's not, strictly speaking, a categorical imperative. Moreover, Kant wants to claim that when we act, we're always acting for what we might call material conditions. So our reason for acting can have formal conditions, it can have a certain form, either it's universalizable or it's not. But our reason for acting, given that we're always acting for certain goals, is going to contain material components, as Kant puts it. So our reason for acting can have, or does have a formal component, but it also has material components. And those components typically involve our purpose, our goal, our end of action. And typically it's also going to include our means, the means that we're going to take to satisfying or achieving our goals. So a Kantian reason ends up having quite a bit involved in it. It also has, at least in some discussion, according to Kant, the circumstances that the particular agent is in when he or she goes to act. So what's crucial here is just that our reasons for acting for Kant always involve material components, always involve, specifically for our purposes, goals. And so Kant wants to provide us with a principle that can regulate our goals for acting, and in a way provide us with an objective goal that all of our actions must aim at. So I'll say that again. The formula of humanity provides us with an objective goal, not a merely subjective one. Otherwise, the principle wouldn't be a categorical one. It provides us with an objective goal that all of our actions must aim at. And this objective goal that our actions must aim at regulates, or is designed to regulate, in various ways, our reason for acting. So just as the formula of universal law, it regulated the form of our reason for acting, the formula of humanity, it regulates the matter or the material components of our reason for acting. And it provides us with an objective goal to always aim at when we act, when we form reasons for acting. Okay, and that latter bit's important, because otherwise we wouldn't have the form of humanity understood as a categorical imperative. So then the question arises, what is the objective aim of all of our actions that serves that regulatory role that I've noted, albeit in sketch-like terms? Well, it's humanity. That's why it's called the formula of humanity. So let me say a couple words about what Kant means by humanity here. Doesn't mean our belonging to the biological group Homo sapiens. For Kant, that's our animal nature, ultimately. So Kant thinks that we have like a pluralistic nature. We have an animal nature. We also have a human nature, or we have humanity, as Kant likes to put it. I'll try to disambiguate here a little bit. That wasn't the clearest. We have humanity in addition to having animality. And our humanity is that part of us that's able to set ends. In other words, to make goals that we attempt to attain, that we attempt to bring about and realize in the world. And then that third part, just to round things out here, that's part of our nature, Kant claims, is our personality. And here, what Kant has in mind is that part of us that's able to take the moral laws, moral principles, and self-legislate with them. We can apply them to ourselves to obey. So that's personality, but I don't want to get too far afield in a discussion of personality, or animality for that matter. I want to lock in on the humanity bit. So Kant's formula of humanity is really dealing with that aspect of our nature, that's able to create ends, and then find or formulate, more accurately, means to achieving or attaining our ends. So that's the relevant sense of humanity that needs to be understood for the formula of humanity. But now, our reason for acting has to be such that it always treats humanity as an end in itself. So when whatever it is that we're aiming at with our actions, in addition to that aim is the aim of treating humanity as an end in itself. So whatever we're doing, it has to take into consideration that humanity is an aim, and it's to be treated as an end in itself, and never as a mere means. So let's talk about what it means to treat humanity as an end in itself first, and then we'll turn to what it would mean to treat humanity as a mere means. So to treat humanity as an end in itself means to treat humanity as an objective end, as something that has significant value in its own right, as something that has, in fact, unconditional value, a kind of intrinsic worth, so the value is inherent in it, but also is unconditional. There is no, as it were, price that we can put on the value of humanity. At least on Kant's view, he takes this to be quite intuitive. And the arguments that Kant even runs for the claim that the value of humanity is unconditional aren't as intuitive to many as the idea itself that we do have this kind of worth. And we think that we have this kind of worth is pretty much taken for granted in contemporary times. And we think that we have this kind of worth because we think that there's no price or value, finite value as it were, that we can put on human life. And so Kant's articulating these ideas, developing them, and they've become, in many cases, in many places, I should say, commonplace. But they haven't always been. I think that's an important note. So I may say these things about humanity, and you're like, of course that's true. it hasn't always been the case that philosophers have believed this, or that human beings have thought this generally. We tend to, and Kant is one of the figures who intended to provide a philosophical foundation to these ideas, that and that explains in part why we study Kant. We study Kant because he's one of these figures who spent careful time, trying to put ideas that now we take to be commonplace on proper philosophical footing. And so, in a way, we owe Kant a debt as being someone who formulated these ideas. And we study Kant lest we forget these ideas. So Kant develops this idea of humanity, and of humanity having this significant unconditional worth, this absolute worth, sometimes he puts it. And in this way, this end is always regulating our reason for acting. So whatever our reason for acting is, whatever purposes we have subjectively when we go to act, we have humanity as this absolute end that governs our particular subjective purposes. Okay, so have whatever purposes I like. I can have them so long as, here's one general way of understanding what's going on here, so long as my having those goals and striving to attain those goals doesn't involve treating humanity as a mere means, and always has me treating humanity as an end in itself. Well, I got a little bit ahead of myself there, so I need to say some things about what it means to treat humanity as a mere means. You can probably guess what it means. It's to treat humanity in such a way that they don't have the value of an end in itself. So to treat humanity as if it had merely conditional worth or non-absolute worth, or such that it had only instrumental value, right? It only had value in helping one attain one's goals. Or maybe another way of putting it is treating humanity in such a way that there's a price that could be assigned to the individual in question. So the paradigmatic case is where one treats one as a mere means, cases like slavery. So when an individual is enslaved, they're treated as if they had merely instrumental value, and they're also owned. They were purchased with finite values. Okay, and so that's a paradigmatic case. So the formula of humanity: always treat humanity as an end in itself and never as a mere means. So always treat humanity with the significant value that it has, right? That its value is beyond anything that we can assign a finite price to. So that's the formula of humanity. Now, I think there's different ways of understanding the formula of humanity and understanding the way in which it regulates our purposes when we act. I think there's a negative sense of understanding it, the formula of humanity, and a positive sense. And the negative and positive senses of the formula of humanity are to be derived from how it is that we understand what it means to treat someone as an end in itself. So I think that one way of understanding what it means to treat someone as an end in itself could be in terms of just not treating them as a mere means. So one treats someone as an end in itself, negatively speaking, if one doesn't treat that individual as a mere means, doesn't treat them as if they have this lesser value than an end in itself. But then there's also a positive sense of an end in itself, which involves actually positively promoting humanity. And what that would amount to is positively doing something to help someone with the ends that they set for themselves. So think about what the notion of humanity here means. And so we can understand then there's a positive sense of the formula of humanity that derives from defining end in itself, positively speaking. And that's when we contribute to the humanity in a positive sense by helping people attain their goals. So we have the negative sense of the formula of humanity and the positive sense of the formula of humanity. Now, Kant does want to connect this notion of humanity, which involves setting ends for oneself, with what it means to be a person, to have a personality. And so there's a technical notion here, as one could gather. I mean, Kant is full of technical notions. The idea of humanity was a technical notion, so it's no surprise that the notion of person would be a technical notion. And remember, to be a person means to be such that one is human because they're able to set ends for themselves, but the irrelevant ends are moral ends. So a person is someone who can take moral principles, and those moral principles serve as ends for themselves. And guess what? They apply them to themselves and do so in such a way that that they're to obey them. So there's a commanding self-legislation that sometimes Kant claims holds here when thinking about persons. So the formula of humanity concerns just thinking about obviously humanity. The notion of persons takes the idea a bit further. For humans, generally speaking, they're also persons because they're able to apply moral principles to themselves, to obey. Now, I want to turn now to this a discussion of some of the potential limitations of Kant's formula of humanity. The limitations point to perhaps the need to reformulate the formula of humanity, to broaden it, as it were, because this is going to turn out, in order to be to fall under the concept of humanity, if I can put it that way, one has to have rational capacities. One has to have the ability to reason, to engage in instrumental reasoning, set ends for themselves, and then determine the means by which they're going to attain their ends. And of course, if you think about just us generally, yeah, of course, that's what all of us can do. Until you start thinking about babies, start thinking about very small children, at least on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, where we think about a timeline with human life. On the other end of the spectrum, okay, some people, due to cognitive impairments and limitations due to natural causes or just due to injury and the like, could lose the capacity to set ends and the means to achieve those ends and the like. So it looks like the formula of humanity, if I can put it this way, doesn't apply to a significant enough subset of individuals that are among us that we think morality should apply to. And many have criticized Kant here because it looks like the formula of humanity would apply to beings like you and I who are watching this and can follow this video, can follow abstract lines of reasoning and the like, but wouldn't apply to our baby brothers and sisters. And would this then mean that they can't be moral victims? That seems to be the wrong result, doesn't it? It seems to be the wrong result. Also, that those who are severely mentally disabled, for example, either due to just natural causes or due to injuries to the organism that they have, it seems like the formula of humanity, given its restrictive scope, isn't going to apply to them, and they're not going to count as moral victims. Okay, at least not themselves. Like, there might be ways in either case, given the different sets here of working out how it is that it would, generally speaking, be wrong to kill such individuals, etc. But it might involve saying that you end up wronging the loved ones of these individuals. It's not too satisfying though, because it seems like we want the wrongness of killing these individuals. Just for example, that's one way in which we think that they could be moral victims, is because they're moral victims. They'd be the primary victims, the primary moral victims. And so it looks like the formula of humanity might end up being too narrow to rule out, or might be too narrow to account for these individuals as moral victims, or being possible moral victims, potential moral victims, more accurately. So that's one line of challenge. And the second line of challenge is really roughly the same, but it's just applied to our animal cousins, to our companion animals, to animals generally, or animals that lack the relevant rational capacities, abilities, etc. Now, it might be the case there's empirical work that would have to be done here, but all we need is a subset of individuals that, a subset of animal individuals that would lack the rationality levels, right? And it looks like the formula of humanity doesn't apply to them, and then they can't be moral victims, when it seems like they can be. And so this has led Kantians to revise Kant and say, oh, Kant had the resources for broadening the formula of humanity relevantly in order to account for the morality of those beings that, strictly speaking, aren't humans or persons. Okay, humans in the humanity sense that Kant laid out in the technical sense of the term. So anyways, this just points to, or this last bit of discussion here, excuse me if I can get my words out, really points to some potential limitations with Kant's formula of humanity, and the need, it seems, if we want to take our ordinary thinking about morality seriously, to broaden the application of the formula of humanity, if it's going to be a serviceable or widely serviceable principle in our moral thinking. So that concludes my discussion in this video of Kant's formula of humanity. I thank you all for watching. If you have any videos, please be sure to comment below, or otherwise get a hold of me. Again, I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.